Good morning.
All right, good morning.
Good morning.
This morning we're going to be looking at Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 31, so you can go ahead and begin turning there. As you turn, I'd like to give a quick introduction to the passage. This passage before us today records a passionate discourse by the Apostle Paul on Mars Hill in Athens. This takes place during the second of his 3 missionary journeys. Athens had been a major factor in politics and economics for many years. And though the power and prestige had waned significantly by this time, in this passage it's still a focus, it's still the epicenter of education in Greek education. There are many interesting statements given about the culture of Athens in this passage, and we're going to look at them briefly this morning. First, it's described as a place full of idols. Everywhere you turn, there were idols. So many so that there is actually an altar made for the unknown God. Next, it said that they were devoted, religious, or superstitious people. They were extremely devoted to worshiping and serving their idols. And Paul's going to draw this out a little bit later in the passage. The third description informs us that they actually had time to study. One of the translations, one of the literal translations says that they had leisure to do these things, and what they would do is they would spend time, and it says in verse 21, in nothing but the hearing or telling of something new. So it's constantly they wanted to be up to date, they wanted to be informed, and they wanted to discuss and debate various philosophies. And so this is the culture in which Paul finds himself. This is more than a record of a speech or a sermon given by Paul. It has direct application to our lives, specifically in how we evangelize and how we live our lives. We would do well to follow and emulate Paul's example in this passage. One other thing to note during the introduction is that there are many similarities between our current culture and the culture of Athens. Athens was full of idolatry. They were a hedonistic society, meaning they were seeking pleasure. They were materialistic. And I think that we can draw the same conclusions about our society. Our idols may not be necessarily carved out of gold or fashioned out of silver, but we have idols in our lives. We have idols in our country. They may be sports. They may be movie stars. They may be cars or houses or whatever the case may be. We're constantly enslaving ourselves to these things. Materialism is now termed consumerism, and it is the driver of our economy. Everyone is looking for that next source of pleasure. The culture of Athens stood in stark contrast to the will of God, and it is the same today in our modern culture. What God calls sin, we call fun. What God forbids, we call an alternative lifestyle. While God invites us to join with Him in fellowship, we spurn His loving advances and we pursue ourselves. So with this as a backdrop, with this perspective in mind, we're going to come to the text today and we're going to see that Paul was engaging a culture very similar to ours. And so we can take away from these things lessons that Paul did some things incredibly right that we can take away and apply to our own lives, and we can have an effective witness wherever we find ourselves. Let's begin in verse 16. We're going to read verse 16 through 18 in Acts chapter 17. Follow along with me. It says this, "Now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him, when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Then the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, 'What does this babbler want to say?' Others said, 'He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection.'" The first thing that I'd like to point out this morning is that we need to be about everyday missions. Think about where Paul found himself. He was alone in Athens, and he was waiting for someone. And so if you go back and look further in the chapter, you'll find that he was waiting for Timothy and he was waiting for Silas. Paul on his missionary journey had been kind of kicked out of Thessalonica, kicked out of Berea, but Timothy and Silas had stayed back in Berea, and so Paul was waiting for Silas and Timothy there in Athens. And so he wasn't really planning on spending a lot of time in Athens, perhaps. He wasn't necessarily, we're not told that he was going to set up shop, so to speak, and begin to proclaim the gospel the way he had been in Thessalonica, the way he had been in Berea. But he was waiting for his companions. While he was waiting, he saw the need. So the first thing that we need to do as we go about our everyday lives is we need to see the need. We need to be aware of the need. He looked around the city and he saw that it was full of idols. Packed full of idols. And when you look around, as you look at the kids in your schools, as you look at people where you work, as you walk through the mall, as you go out to eat, think about what's driving, what's motivating these people. Our society is also full of idols. While he was waiting, he saw the need, and then he became deeply burdened. When reading different translations, we'll find a handful of descriptions for Paul's spirit in verse 16. The King James Version renders it this way: his spirit was stirred within him. In the New King James, as we read here, as I read this morning, his spirit was provoked. In the NIV and some of the others, it says he was greatly distressed. Think about this for just a moment, and think about when you see the need of people in the world today, as you see people in your sphere of influence, when you see their need, are you burdened for it? Are you moved with compassion? His reaction is not dissimilar to Christ in the gospel, as he was moved with compassion for the multitudes. You can see this in Matthew 9, verse 36, Matthew 14:14, or Mark 6:34. It says, when Christ looked upon the multitudes, he was moved with compassion. Think about it in this way. I know for me personally, I'll be watching a TV show or whatever, and on the screen will come a commercial for Save the Children or Feed the Hungry. And whenever I see those children, it hurts right down in here. You know what I'm talking about. Like when we had Todd Bush last year for Journey Weekend, and he showed that picture of those kids for Children's Relief International, and you watch those hungry children and you see them hungering not just for the Word of God, but literally for their daily survival. Are you moved? Are you burdened? And that's the kind of feeling that comes out, that we're moved. So we not only do we see the need and recognize it, we have to be burdened. We have to take compassion. And this comes, we take this example directly from Christ, and then again from Paul. He was moved. Being moved indicates action, and so there's something else that comes along with this. We don't just stop at recognizing the need or being burdened. We have to go into action. And what did Paul do? He did something about it. Of course, recognition is a vital part of the process, but if it does not motivate us to action, it's worthless. If we see someone who's hungry and we have the means to feed them and we don't do it, if we see someone who needs clothing and we have the means to clothe them and we don't do it, James says in chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, that it's worthless. Our religion, our faith is worthless if it doesn't move us to action. And God is not pleased. And so, Paul's reaction is recorded in verse 17. After looking around the city and finding it full of idols, he was appalled. He was burdened. He was distressed by the one idolatry pervading every corner of Athens. And this motivated him to begin reasoning with the people around him. Remember, the first point of this sermon is everyday missions. And so Paul just went and did what he always did. He went to the synagogue and he reasoned with people. He went to where he assumed people would be studying the scriptures, and he started sharing the gospel with them. And then he took it a step further and he took it to the marketplace. And he discussed the gospel with anyone who would listen. That's what we're told. Look at verse 17 for just a moment with me. Therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshippers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happened to be there. Whoever he found, whoever he saw, whoever would listen, he shared the gospel. honestly, this is a challenge in my own life because I have to stop and think. Do I share the gospel? Do I put it on display everywhere I go, every day? And I can't say that I honestly do, but I should. Everywhere I go should be an opportunity for me to present the gospel, whether in word or deed. And Paul was about that, and that's his reaction in verse 17. It's important to note that he was presenting the whole gospel. This is something that we really need to take note of because we can't not give the whole gospel. If we only give part of it, it's worthless. And so Paul in verse 18, he was expounding the gospel, even the resurrection of Christ. And resurrection was something that was completely foreign to these folks. Look at their reaction here. Then a certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him, and some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign gods, because he preached to them Jesus and the resurrection." These first few verses teach us how we are to conduct our lives. Paul sets an outstanding example for personal evangelism. First, like Paul, we must see the need. After a short look around, it became abundantly clear to Paul that the Athenians needed Christ. It was abundantly clear to him. It should break our hearts when we see the lost who are spiritually blind and stumbling and fumbling around in the dark. Thirdly, we should be so burdened we are moved to action. If our burden does not mobilize us, it is useless. So we must see the need, become burdened, and do something about it. Lastly, there's a biblical principle at play here. Believers must be faithful in the small things. And like the faithful servants in the parable of the talents, when we are, God will grant us larger opportunities. You may say, well, how does that work with evangelism? Think about it. Paul was faithful every day. He just went to where he was already going. He went to the synagogues, talked to the people who were already studying the scriptures, and then in the marketplace. And we can do the same thing. And when we are faithful to share the gospel in those small ways, God may grant us bigger opportunities. And God does the same thing for Paul here in the rest of this passage. The next main point is always be ready. Paul has an opportunity to give a defense of the gospel, so we must always be ready. 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to anyone who asks you with meekness and in fear, or gentleness and respect. And so with that concept in mind, we're to always be ready. Paul told Timothy, be ready always to preach the gospel, in season and out of season. And so Paul is setting the example right here for us. This very thing. Let's look at verse 19. We'll read down through 22. And they took him, and they brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new doctrine is of which you speak. For you are bringing some strange thing to our ears. Therefore we want to know what these things mean." For all the Athenians and foreigners who were there spent their time in nothing else but to either tell or to hear something new. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious." We're going to pause there for just a moment. But look at this. The first point that I want to make is that Paul was ready. The Epicureans and the Stoics, it's important to point out, were two kind of feuding philosophies, or camps of philosophies. The Stoics, or rather the Epicureans, were started by Epicurus, and their main thrust, everything that they did, revolved around the pursuit of happiness. They saw that as the main goal of life. For the philosopher, this meant the discovery of knowledge. That was how they became happy. For the common man, just the gratification of flesh would suffice. And so, whatever brought you happiness, whatever was pleasurable, and that was what they pursued. The Stoics believed that one should pursue virtue and not be distracted with either pleasure or pain. It would seem that perhaps the Stoics would have had more in common with Paul's message, yet they were still ignorant of the truth. But here's the key: Paul did not shrink from the task.